conversation we had at the start of the week, which was super interesting, which is almost like on this philosophical level. You proposed a talent stack. Do you want to tell us a little bit about where your head's at with that and your thinking on that?
Yeah, for sure. I suppose it's still, a bit fuzzy, but I've been kind of thinking about, what a talent stack looks like in a traditional organization. And my background is, for a long period of time was recruitment. So something I was just involved in on a daily basis. And, you start to look at, okay, well, what are the different layers here of an organization, any organization in like a trad org setting? Mm-hmm. And my kind of thought process kind of led me to like, you've got, if you look at it from a, top down perspective, you've got, the governance layer, which is like the board / executive level. And then you've got, your tech layer, which is your Web 2, generally Web 2 tools and, coordination efforts and all that sort of stuff. And then you've got, your execution layer, which is essentially a group of like doxed employees that are geographically locked. Generally, some aren't, but, in general, you've got to be in a certain place at a certain time in order to carry out work for, whatever the multitude of reasons are. And then you look at where DAOs are at and where DAOs will be in the future. And it's kind of flipping on its head. So you've got the governance layer, which is your DAO members essentially. And that's kind of your off-chain, on-chain voting, things like that. But it's really DAO membership sort of coordination. And then you've got your tech layer, which is your Web3 and smart contracts. And then your execution layer is kind of skilled pseudonymous contributors that are globally distributed. And that's kind of like where my head was at with regards to this. So it's still something which is forming, but I feel like it's something which kind of needs to be rationalized at some point. So I think it's easier to communicate it to people who don't know what we're talking about, and then B, for us as DAO creators to be able to build the right tooling to move forward with it.
Yeah, and I think we started that conversation because we were talking about, I think we initially, you sort of scoped out that sort of bottom layer as the kind of resource layer.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, which is, if you remember when we first started, talking, we'd set ourselves a group called Not HR. And that's what we're trying to get away from. I think it's this concept that humans are a resource that is different in DAOs. Because it's not a captive resource. So your goal as a centralized organization is capture talent, lock them into some kind of contract, which means they have to work for you and no one else. And if they sort of catch you with a side gig or whatever, this is certainly my context as an academic. So I was juggling crypto on the side, on the sly, constantly in fear that I was going to get rugged by HR when they found out. And it's different here, right? Because it's not. So we sort of tentatively called this the kind of human layer, where you're just like there's humans in underneath the kind of, I think the bankers could call it layer 0, which I like. That is like there's the humans interacting with these sort of crypto economic things, but it's the humans that make the value, if you like. And so I'm just kind of, I think with the way you'd framed it, Matt, is like one of your friends was talking about, if I've lived healthy up to this point, the people in this generation, certainly the next generation, might live into their hundreds. So what's going to happen to the world of work when people need stuff to do when they're retiring at 60 and still have 50 more years of life ahead of them? Like, is there something that DAOs can play into that? So there's this interesting context where DAOs can fit into this highly sessional, totally permissionless, transient work where you can kind of like come in and out, do bits for this DAO, work on stuff you're interested in. Mm-hmm. What is different from HR to what we're doing here? And like you said, Rafa, we don't want to end up in the same highly performative structures that we've ended up elsewhere. It could even be worse. I've seen like people running at this like massified Mechanical Turk type thing, where everyone's doing these like really grindy tasks for little bit tiniest bits of money, and because if it is a resource layer, the resource layer is genuinely global, and you could have 1 million people, fighting over a few $100s or something.
Yeah.
So yeah, I don't know what your thoughts are on that. What does HR look like in DAO world?
So a couple of things come to mind. I agree with kind of like the layer component, but instead of thinking about it as a layer, I more think about it like a mesh, where previously you had a structured layer, like governance defined your operating model, which defined your resource requirement. And yeah, there are like some feedback loops that it's mostly like hierarchical, like that way. Like founder tells you how they're going to build and sell whatever product, and that tells you who you need to hire.
Yeah.
I think when we think about DAOs, I do think about it. It's the opposite, but when I think about the opposite, it's not really the layer on its head. It's more that there is no layer component. There is more. It's more of a mesh. So you've moved from a one-dimensional kind of like structure of delegation into a multi-dimensional kind of relationship environment. So the protocol informs your tech and subcontracts, which informs your community, right? But your community actually sets the mission, which actually sets the need for your tech, which actually defines your governance requirements, and so on and so forth. And so when I think about incentives, I kind of think about it that way, which is your incentives should incentivize maintaining an equilibrium of the mesh, where the protocol doesn't dominate the other two components, because then you're just governance for governance sake. Your tech stack can't like dominate the other two components, because then you turn into a productivity house, and your community can't dominate the other two components, because the community loses its ability to produce if it's just coordination or communication, and not enough like actual automation and production.
Yeah, it's really interesting. So it's a symbiotic relationship between these different. I thought so. We're using a kind of idea of the second phase of our project is called pyramid, because this notion of hierarchy, because I worked for many years as like in the kind of organizational theory sort of lens from an academic point of view, and there's a reason why basically all organizations up to this point fall into this pyramidic hierarchical structure, and DAOs have this desire, or almost like utopian ideal, that they are much flatter or completely flat hierarchy.
Yeah, and they are not. I will state that on the record. They are absolutely not.
Exactly. So one of the concepts that's in our governance framework is the pyramid, and it's the idea of you fall into the tyranny of structurelessness, right?
Yeah.
If you don't articulate the power, there is always a power hierarchy. So we as founders, I've spent many years conceptualizing.
Now recording.
Ooh, that's Craig. A bit late to the party, Craig. But yeah, so there's a pyramidic structure. There's a hierarchy of power. You should articulate what that is. Otherwise, it's there and no one knows what it is, and that's when things go wrong. But what's different about a hierarchical organizational pyramid in the kind of traditional sense is that everyone, the lower layers, are in service to the lowers of the layers above, right? You're doing the job for your line manager, and their line managers have a line manager, and they're working for the board, right? And then and that's what I think changes. There is this, it's like a bi-directional relationship. Every layer is in service to each other.
Yeah. And maybe an alternative way to think about the pyramid is that, the survival is at the top of the pyramid. And everybody is in charge or reporting to the concept of survival. And and then you have different pillars underneath the survival that maybe you can think about your governance component, you can think about your tech layer, and you can think about maybe your community layer. So maybe it's more horizontal, where they each need to inform the other and make sure that they're each covering each other's fractures. So I think I consider governance, for example, in innovation that addresses a lot of voice issues that naturally arise with community between extroverts and introverts, and also distribution, like quadratic voting, for example. And so maybe the way that I kind of think about the more sustainable DAOs are not ones that find an appropriate structure that they can commit to over a longer period of time, but those who find a good balance between how much volatility they introduce to the system to balance each other's forces.
Yeah, they necessarily need. So one of the issues with the pyramid, if you like, in the traditional sense, is that the game is to get up the pyramid, right? So I worked in a heavily, so like I was in university context, so I ended up as an associate dean in a institute, and like spent 20 years, going through the degree, the qualification layers to get to PhD, and then just went into a different, pyramid to climb, which is, through the different layers of lecturer, senior lecturer, director, so, all that sort of stuff. And what happens is the people at the upper echelons of this, they build the systems to stop them being disrupted. So there's, once you're there, it's not a fluid system. You only go up. You know what I mean? There's like, so you'd find like people in, and it's similar to like the academic institutions. I would say there's only two older institutions, and it's the military and the church. And they're similar in the sense that you get these positions of power, and once you're there, and you can be totally ineffective, or even just the opposite of effective, and be destructive for the institution, but it's very difficult to get you out because you end up making the rules that maintains the structures that keep you where you are.
That's right. And I think something that's interesting when I reflect on this is, Matt, you asked like some of the key takeaways for the article too, and one of them is this concept of being able to get in the habit of creating recipes. So like empowerment, guidance of empowerment, instead of instructions and policies, which maintain a specific environment. And so when I think about compensation as well, you can create certain levels of automation and programmability, which is great because it gives you efficiency. But to be able to constantly balance between the different forces, something I think about is, okay, so how do I empower the community to adjust and manipulate the incentives based on what the environment kind of needs? Because the community is going to be the intelligent component of the other process, right? Governance is going to be a process. Technology is going to follow certain levels of instructions. And so the community is in charge of redirecting kind of resources and behaviors based on that.
Yeah, so I think I've sent you the article that I wrote on governance optimization. And this is this idea that whatever process you make, it needs to be built with the mind that it's going to be replaced in the future.
That's right.
So it's because it essentially, which is the opposite of the conventional paradigm in blockchain governance at the moment, which is governance minimization. I build this thing, code is law, it doesn't change anymore. Yeah, and that kind of works in these, game theoretic battlegrounds. I think there's probably only going to be one sensible governance minimized system, and that's Bitcoin. And even that's debatable whether it should be one or not. But that's the kind of paradigm, and there's like, and what it creates is a context where I've made the rules as the network creator, and that maintains my power in that system or the rules that I've created indefinitely.
Yeah, exactly. And kind of, I have, excuse me. I don't know where I picked this up, but I read somewhere like any static system gets hacked.
Yeah.
And like I think the role of the DAO is to actually escape that by not being a static system.
Yeah.
So don't go for flat, don't go for hierarchy, actually go for neither. And use hierarchy when it's to your advantage, use the appropriate hierarchy within the specific context, use fully democratic consensus when it's needed. And the when it's required is kind of like the key of the DAO, which is the DAO should not be constrained by the traditional policies and structures that I think corporations are restricted by. And that to me is kind of where the magic happens. And incentives then need to be designed in a way that stimulate that kind of non-static environment. And that's, going back to this concept of seasons, going back to this concept of, how static is your reward system? Well, the point is your reward system should not be static, because if it is, you calcify your own collaboration processes.
Yeah, exactly. And this is one of the conversations that I've been having with Matt this week. So we've got these jobs on our job board. People want this, how much am I getting paid? A kind of static reward. So let's say we've got this repeated task of analyze the data from our prediction market system, or analyze the data from our yield farming system. And we'll pay you $2,000 for doing it. You've priced that in, then that becomes a kind of static paradigm for what that work is worth. And if you're going to change it again, then someone's going to be upset about it one way or another. So we've got this finite pot of money. So we're going to give out finite pot of money in this first distribution, and we don't know how many people are going to be in that distribution yet. It can still change, So there's something interesting about the retroactive airdrop thing and the retroactive public goods idea. Is like, I've just turned up and contributed because I love this thing and I want to see it succeed. And then if your contribution becomes important, then you get a reward for it. The next step, I think, is moving towards this, like a prospective version of that, where there's always this distribution coming. It's not a one-off airdrop. It's a rolling thing. And then what we need to do is find a way of dynamically pricing in the work and the contribution without these static pricing thing, because it's like the work that comes in is relatively priced almost, and the price of the token is, so let's say we go, okay, we'll give you 10,000 FVT for that. That might be $500 now, but it could be 20 grand in the future, and so static pricing doesn't really work.
Have you in traditional organizations, have you come across the concept of zero-based budgeting before, as ZBB?
I think so, but tell me what you mean by it.
So in traditional corporations, they get, like, especially large ones, whenever a new CEO comes in, this is a very classic thing that they love to do with, like, McKinsey or one of the big four consulting firms. They have this project called zero-based budgeting. And so the issue is that when you do budgeting year on year, you run into the same issue that you just said, which is it's static pricing of the function requirements. So if sales got $1 million last year, we got to give sales at least $1 million this year because they spent all their money last year. So that's relative budgeting, carryover budgeting. So consulting firms do this really brutal exercise called zero-based budgeting, which is they assume that they start the organization from zero and then they allocate money, and they don't use previous years as an anchor point for budget distribution. Now, this is often quite brutal because it's often done when you need operational efficiencies, of course, which is code for cutting heads. But the exercise is quite interesting because of the fact that it's trying to get to the organization outside, at least divorce the organization a bit of the momentum that it's developed so far in terms of budget allocations. I strongly suspect that DAOs are going to have continuous zero-based incentive design, which is you're going to have to change up both the bounty board and the roles that you have and how much you're allocating to each of the guilds and all of that fairly constantly.
Yeah, completely agree.
Because and a big driver of this, I think, will be my hypothesis is that prices within DAOs are not market anchored, they're internally demand anchored. Like if you have a security flaw in your governance protocol, you will pay whatever developer, whatever it is 10% of your treasury, right, to solve that security problem immediately.
Yeah.
You won't pay the market price for a security consultant. That doesn't exist.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
so, but you also have the ability to do price collusion across DAOs to say security consultants always get paid X amount to solve this type of problem. So there's a balancing force there. But I do think that the DAOs that take on this internal demand process are going to be much more successful because if they can do it well, because they'll be able to put resources where they're needed based on mission requirements instead of where resources are because of market payout benchmarks, which is like everybody's going into product right now because the pay is higher. That doesn't necessarily mean that product managers are the most in demand necessarily.
Yeah. And I like the zero-based budgeting thing, and it's sort of almost instinctively that's what we've gone for each quarter.
That's
of our
right.
distribution. It'll be essentially blank slate restarted because having managed budgets in institutions like that, you get into this weird scenario where somewhere towards the end of the budgeting cycle, everyone goes, I've got to spend this much money to get it again next year. And everyone just blows their cash for the last 2 months of the cycle. Because if you don't spend it, you don't get it. And that kind of, that's it. So that zero-based budgeting, it's like a frame-breaking idea where it's like take you out of the convention that you've put yourself in and break it down to zero and start again. So I think we're into that.
Something else that comes to mind while we're chatting about this though is like just because you're doing zero-based incentives or budgeting alignment doesn't mean that your community headcount target goes up or down, right? And I think this is where some interesting dynamics come in because you can have a vastly different like budget for next month, but if your DAO ecosystem is healthy, talent flow between DAOs is no longer a responsibility of the DAO itself. So like if I can't make money at finance.vote anymore, then there is an expectation that because of low friction, I will go use my talents elsewhere within the DAO ecosystem that I'm a part of.
So it's that, I suppose there'll just become that natural flow of talent moving within the DAO space.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But without, it goes back to what you said earlier on. I think Nick said it, like that whole capture thing, you know, because I suppose initially DAOs are probably looking to like, not necessarily capture talent, but, you know, ideally sort of have key contributors that they can kind of rely on, so to speak. But in the future, it'll be just like you say, like fluid, basically.
Yeah, but you do have a minimal capture talent requirement for any DAO, which is kind of like the keep the lights on component. And I think that's something that we shouldn't fight against, but more so like accept as a requirement. And I don't think a lot of people are going to be willing to be captured talent, except a very small select group of people in each of the DAOs.
Yeah, I wrote a tweet like last week on this, and I still think loyalty matters in DAOs.
Mm-hmm.
And this is why we've got this kind of like DAO leadership layer, and it is almost expected in that layer that we are at least your primary DAO, right? This is where you're gonna, because otherwise you do dilute yourself. And you know, I've heard this conversation about, well, how many DAOs can you juggle before you start doing them all in effectively?
Yeah.
And that is a really interesting question. I think we'll see that, and I think it depends on how integral you are to that DAO. If you are in this kind of like turn up and do some sessional work stuff, then fine, juggle as many as you can, many jobs as you can within that and get as much money as you can.
Or hire a virtual assistant or scale your time with additional software.
Yes, right? Absolutely. But yeah, it will it will change working practices considerably. Just that lack of gating on the institutional boundaries is going to be both good and bad emergent sort of properties that come out of that social dynamics.
Yeah, I think one last comment, and maybe we should ask people if they want to ask questions. I think that for the first time, loyalty is being rewarded in a very long time. So previously, if I worked for a startup, it didn't matter how loyal or committed I was to the startup, I would never get paid more. And I think this is where contribution zones and this commitment component really is again another type of innovation, because you actually have quantifiable reward for commitment level.